the rapture. And now I want to talk to you about the history behind the Left Behind movement, behind the Left Behind theology. As I indicated before, the fancy term for this is premillennial dispensationalism. And I want to unpack that term because it's a very important term for us to appreciate and understand. The term premillennial refers to the idea or the belief that Christ will return prior to a 1,000-year reign on earth. So pre indicates before, and the millennial refers to the millennium era. And so those who are premillennial dispensationalists believe that the book of Revelation and other books of the Bible indicate that Christ, after his second coming, will establish a 1,000-year reign on earth, and that the centerpiece of this 1,000-year reign on earth will be the temple in Jerusalem. The dispensationalism part of this definition refers to the idea or the belief that history, salvation history especially, is broken up into a series of dispensations or different eras. This is actually not unique to this particular theology. In fact, Catholics believe that history is broken up into different eras. For instance, we believe that the Old Dispensation, the Old Testament, is separate in some ways from the New Dispensation. But as Catholics, we also believe that there is a continuity between the two, especially in the person of Jesus Christ. However, dispensationalists believe that each of these eras, and most of them believe that there are 7 different eras in history, are utterly distinct from one another. What they believe is that in each of these eras, God tests mankind, and humanity fails every single one of these tests. And so salvation within each of these eras is actually different in each one. There's actually a different form of salvation in each section of history, of salvation history. Premillennial dispensationalism, then, is a form of millenarianism. Now, millenarianism is just a way of saying that people believe there will be a time of utopia and peace on earth. Some believe it will be 1,000 years. Some believe it will be an indefinite length of time. And it's not just a religious concept. For example, the Nazis actually were millenarians in a sense because they believed that the Third Reich would be this time of utopia and peace on earth. And there's been similar ideas within communism, for instance. But it's really within religious groups that you see this idea of a millennial era. And not just within Christianity, but within Judaism, and even within certain New Age groups and bodies of people. I want to provide here a history of dispensationalism. And so when I speak of dispensationalism, just remind yourself that I'm speaking about the Left Behind theology. And the key point here is that dispensationalism has really only existed for about 175 years. This might come as a surprise to many people because those who believe in the rapture and those who are dispensationalists will often state that they get their beliefs directly from the Bible. They will say, for instance, that the Bible teaches dispensationalism, that the Bible is actually the blueprint for this idea of dispensations, of a premillennial kingdom. But as we'll examine and show, this isn't exactly the case. And in fact, dispensationalism, with its unique belief in the rapture, separate from the second coming, is a relatively new idea. The man who came up with this belief system and put it together was named John Nelson Darby. Now, Darby lived from 1800 to 1882, and he was an ex-Anglican priest who became very frustrated with what he believed was spiritual laxity among Anglicans and among the Anglican denomination. And so Darby, out of his frustration, left the Anglican Church and joined a group called the Plymouth Brethren. And this was in about 1830. And at that time, Darby began to develop his unique ideas about the end times. And a thing to remember here is that John Nelson Darby lived at a time in the early 1800s when there was a lot of speculation about the end of the world. Many ideas about how the world would end, about Bible prophecy, about the book of Revelation, about the prophecy of Daniel. And Darby was caught up in this interest in Bible prophecy. And so he began to put together a form of theology that would eventually be known as dispensationalism. The centerpiece of Darby's belief system was a radical dualism between the heavenly and the earthly. And this is really an essential point that most people don't know about. Darby believed that when Christ came 2,000 years ago, he offered an earthly Davidic kingdom to the Jewish people. But he also believed that this was rejected by the Jewish people, that all of them turned away from this offer of an earthly, political, Davidic kingdom. And so he said at that point, Christ, being rejected, had to form a new people of God, the church. And he states in his writings that Christ at that point became wholly a heavenly person, completely a heavenly person, that he no longer had anything to do with the events of earth. This is a rather unique idea and is, of course, very incompatible with Catholic teaching. And so what Darby taught was that God actually has two people in history. He has the heavenly people, the church or Christians, and the earthly people, the Jews. And what Darby taught is that the Old Testament prophecies to the Jewish people containing promises of land and prosperity have not yet been fulfilled, and that will occur, the fulfillment of those will occur in the future during that 1,000-year millennial reign following a second coming. But currently, Darby said, we're living in the church age or the church dispensation. And he says that this is a unique dispensation because it was not planned beforehand, that it was kind of a plan B that God had to come up with when the Jews rejected Christ. Now, you might recognize that this is a little bit strange from a Catholic perspective, because as Catholics believe, and as the Eastern Orthodox believe, and as most Protestants believe, when Jesus came and offered a kingdom, it was not an earthly kingdom, but a spiritual kingdom, one that would transform people from the inside out, one that would save them from sin, not just from political oppression. And Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and most Protestants believe that not all Jews rejected Christ. In fact, all of the first Christians were Jewish. It's a very important point because there is a continuity, again, in the Catholic perspective between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And it all centers on the person of Jesus Christ. Now, Darby's ideas actually were not very well received by many of his Protestant brethren at the time. And an important point here is that this is not a Catholic versus Protestant issue. Some of the strongest and harshest critics of this left-behind theology of dispensationalism are other Protestants. But I think that Catholics must understand the history and the background, because so many Catholics have to deal with this and address questions raised by their fundamentalist or evangelical friends. Darby, as I mentioned, did not have a lot of success in his own day. He was tireless in his efforts to spread his beliefs, and he traveled to America and Canada several times from England trying to spread his idea of the rapture. And the rapture in Darby's system comes from this simple logic. If, as Darby believed, there were two people of God, the earthly and the heavenly, then God at some point in history will have to remove the heavenly people and take them up to get back to his initial emphasis, which is on the Jewish people, on the earthly people. And so the rapture becomes a necessary means of removing the heavenly people so they will go to their heavenly home so God can address and deal with the earthly people. And that's what the rapture is all about, and that's where it comes from. This idea of the rapture did not exist prior to the 1800s, or if it did, it was taught very ambiguously by just a handful of people. And none of those had developed a full theological system, as did Darby. A key person then in spreading Darby's beliefs was a man named Cyrus Scofield, who lived in the early part of the 1900s. And in 1909, Scofield put together what is called the Scofield Reference Bible, which was a King James Bible with his notes following Darby's teachings. And Scofield was an ardent disciple of Darby. And so Scofield put this together in his scripture. He put all these notes in, explaining his beliefs about the end times, about the rapture, about the coming millennial kingdom. And that Bible became known as the Fundamentalist Bible because it would eventually go on to sell millions of copies, somewhere between 10 and 15 millions, and would have a powerful impact on fundamentalists and evangelicals in the 20th century. Then, skipping ahead, you come to the person of Hal Lindsay. Maybe you've heard of Hal Lindsay or his best-selling book, The Late Great Planet Earth. That book was published in 1970. And what Hal Lindsay did in that very short, popular book is to present Darby and Scofield's beliefs in a way that was very exciting, sensational, and tied into current events and all of the difficulties in the world occurring at that time. That book would go on to be the biggest-selling nonfiction book of the past 30 years. It has now sold well over 40 million copies. And so the influence of Hal Lindsay's book cannot be overemphasized. It had a dramatic impact on how Americans viewed the world, how they viewed the crises in the world, especially in the Middle East. And it caused many people to have an anticipation of the rapture in their lifetime. In fact, Hal Lindsay was very fond and continues to be very fond of saying the rapture will occur within our generation. We are the chosen generation. The Left Behind books, as I've talked about already, first came out in 1995, and there are now 12 books total in this series, and they've sold nearly 60 million copies. And they are the latest means by which this idea of the Left Behind theology has been propagated and promoted. And so as we see in this history, the idea of a rapture and the idea of the Left Behind theology has only been around for about 175 years. It was started because of this idea that Christ actually failed when he came to earth 2,000 years ago. That because he was rejected, according to Darby, by the Jewish people, God had to found a second people, the church. This belief is obviously incompatible with the Catholic Church's teaching, which clearly states in many different forms and ways that the church is a continuation of the promises made to Israel, and that there's a continuity found in the person of Jesus Christ. We'll examine that idea in more detail in the upcoming section.
Carl Olsen has